over the content of the course. And I'll explain the way that they're sort of formatted as the thing goes on. Um, so let's talk about people in their governments. First, let's talk about citizenship, and we've already talked about this a little bit in class, and so there's not a whole lot that we need to go into. But the dictionary definition is a legally recognized subject or national of a state or commonwealth, either native or naturalized. We already addressed that sort of with the idea that you're a citizen of the United States, but within a more broader perspective, a citizen is anyone that's a member of a group, a society. It can be anything as small as a club or organization in your community or your community. It could be your community, or as large as the world. So you can be both a global citizen and you can be a community citizen. So it sort of scales. Really quickly, you'll notice here on this slide, I've highlighted certain words in green. These will be vocabulary words that you need to hit on throughout the module. I've covered almost all of them in this presentation, and I will have a quiz before you move on to the next module over this vocab. So you may want to write it down and define those. So we've got citizen rights and responsibilities, and we're going to talk about citizens having rights and responsibilities next. The idea of rights versus responsibilities. When you think of rights, you should think of myself. So I have freedom of speech. I have freedom of religion. Rights are freedoms that other people should not take away from you. I say should because there have been instances of governments taking away rights from people, not necessarily the United States, although we did with, for example, slavery. We took away freedoms from people that should have had it, but theoretically speaking, rights are things that you should be allowed to have no matter what, and that sort of changes based on what government you're in, but at least within the United States there are some key freedoms that we think that people have. Freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, and several other freedoms that you'll learn over the course of the class. Think about it. What are some rights that you have? Just jot those down in your notes, and think about sort of what rights that you have and that you experience in your life. Now, for responsibilities, this is where you think other people. Responsibilities are things you owe back to the society you belong to. So you should think about what you feel responsible for. The best way to think about this is sort of I am responsible for, and some of us, especially as teenagers, we don't necessarily think within a society there is a responsibility for the health and welfare of other people. At least some people think so. This is a major argument in American politics, and the sort of sliding scale between how responsible you are versus how much freedom you should have, that we're going to touch on a lot. But as a member of a society, in this particular case, the country, which is governed by the government of America, you have responsibilities. You have to pay things like taxes, and you have to pay things like taxes, and you have to follow laws. Those are responsibilities that you have. What are things that you feel responsible for in your life? You got a lot of you will be moving into adulthood. You're seniors now, and you've gotten a lot more responsibilities than you did probably when you started high school, and they're just going to increase. And some of you have had, a pretty rough go of things. And so you should start thinking critically now about what is it that you feel responsible for. So let's talk about governments. These are organizations created by people to protect people. And so from what, you ask? So why are governments created? Well, they can protect people from each other, from other governments, or from themselves. One theory on how government came about is this idea that back whenever we were tribal, we would organize into groups, and we would organize our tribes so that we could help defend against other tribes that might be attacking us. That's an interesting sort of concept, this idea that maybe maybe we are primarily interested in defense originally, but now our governments are responsible for a lot of other things. At least within the world that, at least within the United States and for a lot of other countries, we believe that governments have responsibilities to citizens, and that citizens have responsibilities to their government. So it's a trade-off. The government the way that citizens usually express those responsibilities. So if I say, feel like it's my job to make sure that people are educated for me to start a school, because I'm just one person. But if I pay taxes, the government can take those taxes and can use them from other people, and they can use them more efficiently than, oh, my computer wants to restart. Let me make sure that doesn't happen. It can use them more efficiently than if, say, it's just one or two or even a handful of people working together. So governments organize the efforts of people to be responsible to other citizens. The trade-off with more responsibility is that you have to trade in rights. So you trade in rights and freedoms, and in return, your government handles things for you. So the most common one is you trade in certain rights in exchange for defense. And a lot of people will say that defense is the only responsibility of government. A lot of people think that the only thing the government needs to do is to have an army to protect its citizens, and everything else should just be taken care of by sort of trade and markets. We'll talk about that more in economics. But this idea that at its basic implementation, government is citizens trading certain amounts of freedom. So, for example, your freedom to just go and loot from other people's houses and to steal and things like that, you trade in those freedoms, which are probably freedoms that most people don't want anyway, because stealing is, for most people, wrong. You trade in those freedoms in exchange for having a government that will protect you. So the government says, you know what, we'll protect you, we'll create police officers, and we'll create firefighters and things like this. But in exchange for that, we're going to create laws, and those laws are going to make it so that you can't just go burn down people's houses, and you can't take whatever you want, and you can't kill people. And those are sort of the trade-offs that you make to have a government. Governments are the most common way that civic responsibility is expressed. Almost everyone has a government. There are very, very few people in the world that don't have a government. And the government is an expression of that civic responsibility. Okay, so let's talk about these trade-offs that I'm talking about for rights and responsibilities. So taxes are a very good example. What is a right that you're trading? And the right is property, the right to do whatever you want with that money that you make. And then the responsibility is they provide programs and services for society. So the trade-off here is you pay taxes so the government can run. A really good example of this, if you have a job, you see income tax, file your taxes at the end of the year, you won't be paying any of that because you won't, as teenagers, you're probably not making enough money that you actually have to pay income tax. But there are other taxes you do have to pay that are taken out of your paycheck. Social Security, which it helps to pay for older individuals to live in society, and then Medicare, which helps to pay for health insurance for the uninsured, for the poor. But other taxes that you pay on a daily basis are sales tax and property tax. Sales tax, it goes to a lot of government stuff like roads and the mail and stuff like that. And property tax goes mostly to schools. So the property tax that you pay, which will be taxes on a car or on a house, you pay those, and then the government uses that money primarily to help fund schools. So that's an example of a trade-off. The right here is your property and your freedom to do with whatever you want with all the money you have versus your responsibility helping to pay for the government so that it can run. Okay, another good example of a trade-off is traffic laws. The right is to move about freely. Within the United States, the ability to drive a motor vehicle is technically considered a privilege. You have to apply for and you have to apply for a license. Well, not apply for a license, but you have to submit for a license, and you have to pass a test. So you're not guaranteed the right to drive a car, but you are guaranteed within most parts of the world or of the country to move around freely. So if you want to walk somewhere, you can. If you can drive, then you can usually drive somewhere. The only flip side to this is there's a responsibility, which is to not. If you are moving about freely in your car, so the right to move about is the right here. Driving the car is the privilege. But regardless of that, if you're trying to move about freely, and but you're driving a car, the trade-off here is you have to obey traffic laws so as to not harm other people. This one's a little bit more complicated, but the idea still stands. You can't just go driving off like a madman off of the roads at whatever speed you want, through stoplights, whatever, because if you do that, you're going to hurt other people. So the government says, you know what, you can move about freely, and you can move about freely in a way that is just really efficient, driving cars. But if you're going to do that, we're going to set laws so that you don't hurt each other. Now, down at the bottom of this slide, I have a question in red. These are what I call critical questions because they're critical thinking questions. What you need to do is, at the end of the presentation, answer these. So if you want to start on another sheet of paper and go ahead and write an answer to this, you can definitely do that. And then you can just turn it in. There will be an assignment posted on Canvas. So write that down, maybe the question down, and then after the presentation is over, you can think about it. But the one that I put here, what are other examples of trade-offs of rights for responsibilities? How much freedom is too much freedom, and how much responsibility is too much? That's a really big question that people have been asking for years in American politics. When is too much freedom when do people have too much freedom, and when do they have too much responsibility? Should I be expected to pay for other people to have things? Or should I be able to carry a weapon wherever I want? These are political issues, and they are at their core questions of rights and responsibilities. Okay, so let's talk about the origins of government. I know that in your book it talks about the four theories, but the one that I really want to touch on here is the social contract, because that is primarily what we operate under in the United States. So there are two major concepts you need to understand. First of all is the rule of law. Governments run by laws that organize and define the mission of a government. So the United States, our laws are derived from the Constitution. The Constitution says what the government can and can't do, and the government has to follow the Constitution. That is the law that holds the government accountable. Outside of that, the government can create laws for us. They can pass laws that tell us what we can and can't do, as long as they don't violate the Constitution. The Constitution is the law for the government. You can think of that as the rules the government has to obey, and the rules that the government make are the rules that we have to obey. Okay, social contract, and this is a vocab word. Citizens recognize the government as legitimate and obey the laws it sets forth. So, to give you an example of a social contract, we live in a social contract society because our government creates laws and we follow them. We don't disobey them for the most part. I know that's not entirely true, but we obey laws, and we look at the power of the government, which is, the president and Congress, and they have the military supporting them, but we look at the power of the government and we say, you know what? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and agree to listen to you, government. In other places where there are things like revolutions, the social contract isn't really working. The people may have a government in place, but they don't really believe in or support the government, so they don't do anything the government tells them to, or and that's when you end up getting oftentimes civil wars or revolutions. A really good example of this, an illegitimate government, so when the social contract has been broken, is during the American Revolution. Colonists rebelled because they felt that the British government was illegitimate. You may remember this back in 8th grade. Taxation without representation, the intolerable acts, things like that. So they stopped obeying the government. They rebelled against it. They took up arms and they went to war with the government because they said, you know what, this is illegitimate. That's the social contract in play. The social contract was broken. They no longer trusted their government, and so the government no longer had power because they were not being given the consent of the governed. We are the governed. We give consent to the government by obeying laws on a daily basis. So obedience to the law. I already talked about this. Governments have to follow their own laws, but when they don't follow their own laws, so say that the United States started taking away freedom of speech from people, people will often look at them as illegitimate. that will be a breach of the social contract, because we trusted the government to follow its own laws, and it stopped. So we no longer trust this government. We no longer look at it as legitimate. It doesn't always just happen like with like one law. So like, say for example that tomorrow they decided to shut down all the newspapers in the country. That doesn't necessarily mean the social contract is broken. The social contract would be broken when people stop listening to their government altogether. If shutting down all the newspapers were enough for everyone in the country to rebel, that would be a breach of the social contract. If it wasn't, if it still needed more things, so like first they shut down the newspapers, then they shut down, we'll say, all the churches, and then people get really fed up, that would be a breach of the social contract. It's whenever people stop recognizing their government as legitimate. So I want you to answer, and I already sort of alluded to this, but do you actually think the social contract still exists? Because there are some people that say it doesn't. And tell me why or why not. One thing I will key you in on here, and this is just one thing to think about, and it isn't necessarily the only way you have to go with it, but do we really have the power to stop our government if we disagree with what it does? And so I encourage you to look at what's going on in Ferguson right now to maybe see if that's something you agree with. Okay, and so finally what we're going to do is we're going to look at a case study of rights and responsibilities. And we're going to look at September 11th. And most of you were very young when this happened. But following the terrorist attack on September 11th, which if you're not familiar with it, there were several planes that were hijacked and flown into major parts of the East Coast, including the Pentagon and the World Trade Center in New York. And it killed thousands of people. There were terrorist attacks. Following that, government put into place many changes to laws. One of the most controversial changes has been increased security at airports. So if you've ever flown on a plane, you can sometimes get stopped and they will randomly search you. And then that changed in 2010. They didn't just start doing random searches. What they did is they had a full body scanner. And what the full body scanner would do is it would scan through your clothes and it would send out an image of your naked body. I mean, it would be like the colors would be distorted, but it would be an image of your naked body. And the idea was here was that the Transportation Security Administration officers at the airport would be able to search your body for weapons. Okay, and if you didn't want to be put through this machine that would then transmit your naked body to complete strangers, you could opt for a pat down, which was a very, very invasive invasive search where the officer would rub their hands all over you. I don't mean to make that sound crude, but they would rub their hands all over you trying to see and feel for any sort of weapons that you might have. Some people feel that those are unjust. They say, you know what, the government does not have the right to invade my privacy and my body like that. I do not feel comfortable with that happening. But other people are like, you know what, terrorists took over some planes and flew them into the Twin Towers. So I'm totally fine with that. What I want you to think about is, first of all, what responsibility is the government performing here? And then second of all, what rights are being given up? And then third of all, and I didn't put this down there, but I do want you to answer it, are you okay with this? And where for you right now after this presentation do you say that line lies? Are you more interested in safety or are you more interested in freedom? That's a decision that you need to make, and so hopefully you can. And then that should be enough for this particular lesson. If you guys have any questions, like always, just see me.